Hi, I'm Stephen Davenport, and I'm in one of my most favorite bookstores, Orinda Books, in Village Square in Orinda, California. It's a marvelous bookstore, big and roomy, and you can see a small portion of it. It's very big, lots of books, every kind of book, and the staff is marvelous. What I really love about the staff is you come in here and you're talking to people who aren't selling, underarm deodorant, used cars. They're not really selling anything. They're purveying their own love of literature to people who also love books and want to come in here, be surrounded by real books they can pick up in their hands and browse and hang out. So as I say, it's been here for 42 years, and I'm really grateful to independent bookstores for being in communities, serving us, because the best way to find a book is in a place where the physical books are available to you. So another great thing about this bookstore is it does really wonderful events, both at lunchtime and the evening, author readings. They're very interesting. I've been to quite a few of them. And that's what I'm about to do now. I'm about to read from my novel, Saving Miss Olivers, which will come out in September 18, published by West Winds Press, an imprint of graphic arts books. Saving Miss Olivers is book one of the Miss Oliver School for Girls saga, which is 3 novels. And I'm about to read to you a passage where the legendary teacher, Frances Plummer, teaches a class of 9th grade girls, which in the very feminist culture of Miss Olivers are called fresh women. He will be teaching them a poem by Robert Frost, which you probably all know, Home Burial. And the reason I picked this passage is that at the moment in the book covers, it's a very contentious moment in the politics of the school. And Francis Plummer is one of the antagonists, and he's the most politically powerful person in the school. The reason being that he's such a great teacher. It brings power to him, the alumni and students love him. And the other reason I'm choosing this passage is I wanted readers to see a great teacher, minute by minute, making decisions in class and doing a wonderful job. So here we go. And on the other side of the campus, in the classroom that had been his for 33 years, Francis' spirits began to lift. He was about to do what he did best. The bell had just rung. The students in his 9th grade English class trooped in and took seats along the outer edge of a 3-sided square of tables. Francis stood at the front of the classroom just inside the square, like an actor in a theater whose stage projected out into the audience. Home Burial, he said, by Robert Frost. It was one of the poems he had assigned for them to read last night. The girls opened their books to the page and followed him as he recited this poem from memory about the young New England husband who from the bottom of the stairs catches his wife staring from the landing above him out the window at the little graveyard behind the house where their firstborn lies. He didn't try to hide how much he loved this poem he'd been teaching for years, how it really was by heart. For Francis, there could have been no greater draw on his compassion than a parent who'd lost a child. It took him several minutes to recite his long poem, and when he finished, there was silence, which he allowed to linger. He knew that many of these kids, whose programmed childhoods had been thicketed with expensive lessons in tennis, soccer, yoga, piano, gymnastics, martial arts, and the skills of outdoing less affluent people in the taking of standardized tests, seldom heard poems recited from memory. For who among their parents had time or the inclination to memorize a poem? He wondered if Sarah Warrior, the only Native American in the school, who had been watching him intently from the back of the room, was an exception. Her head had not been down in her book like the other girls. Was that because she didn't need to follow with her eyes? She could listen? Maybe her people didn't hold their stories at arm's length, as if borrowing them for only a little while. Maybe they took them into memory, drawing them up inside themselves and owning them. But next to Sarah, what Amy Leverett was intent on is showing how disengaged she was. She was slouching as far back from the table as she could get at the rear of the room without knocking the Globe Theater off its table. Black pants, black leather jacket on this hot September day, black hair dyed even blacker, and spiked straight up. Still intent on improving the students' attire, Fred Kindler, the headmaster, had told Amy to take the ring out of her nose on her very first day of school. She'd been looking for revenge ever since. "Well, Amy, what did you think of the poem?" Frances asked her. He usually stayed away from such open-ended questions for their tendency to engender uncritical, self-reflective answers. But if he didn't smoke Amy's distemper out into the room, it would subvert the class for the rest of the period. Amy slouched still further. "I think it's boring," she said. "Why do you say that?" As if he didn't know the answer. Because he was yet another adult who professed to know what was good for her, what clothes she should wear, what poetry she should love as much as he did. If she were to be seduced by this poem, the anger she'd been nurturing for months would begin to melt. And then who would she be? "Because you asked," Amy said. "Boring," he repeated. "Yeah, boring." "How do you know, Amy?" There was no challenge to the question. He just wanted to know. "Because I was bored," Amy said. "How else would I know?" "Well, Amy, that's one way to find out." He was smiling, relaxed. He was not going to blame her, but the entitled upbringing that made her answer by talking about herself. Besides, he liked her nervy quickness. Because he wouldn't fight, she didn't know how to respond to him. She looked around. Her classmates weren't looking at her. They were looking at Frances. "But it's the poem I like the best," Francesca Burke objected. She sat up very straight to the left of Frances, her back to the blackboard, her red hair lightened by the windows across the room. She leaned forward, her arms on the table, her feet wiggling nervously beneath it. Frances knew she was going to explain why she liked the poem. That's exactly what he didn't want. He put his hand up to Francesca, smiling gently. "Wait," he said. Francesca returned his smile, thinking he'd asked her to hold up long enough for the others to understand what he and she already did. "Do any of you live in a house like the one in the poem?" he asked the class. No one raised her hand. "No one?" he repeated. Usually there were several. "I do," Joanna Perrine finally admitted. Her voice was tentative and shy. He knew from reading the admissions officer's notes to the faculty about incoming students that Joanna had lost her brother in a skiing accident a few years before. "We live in New Hampshire too," she added. She sat to Frances's right by the windows across from Francesca. Under the table, her long legs reached out toward the empty space in the center of the room. Everybody knew she was from New Hampshire. It's not what she was trying to say. "The front door is at the foot of the stairs in our house too," Joanna murmured. He needed to keep this safe for her. He had better be careful. But if she didn't want to engage with this poem about a loss so like her own from a house just like the one she lived in, she wouldn't have raised her hand to answer his question. Maybe she'd found some solace in the poem, which she wanted to secure more deeply. At any rate, his heart went out to her. He would help her engage. He would bring her up to the front to help him teach. "Can you draw it for us, Joanna?" he asked. Joanna hesitated, not sure what he wanted. "The way the scene in the poem is laid out," he explained. He turned, stepped to the blackboard behind him, took a piece of chalk from the tray beneath it, and held it up, inviting her, and she got up from her place at the table, moved across the space to him, took the chalk, turned her back to the class, and started to draw. She made a perpendicular line on the board and labeled it front door, as far away from the graveyard as she could get, Frances thought. Then just to the right, a side view of a staircase ascending to the right. She labeled the top step landing. Then to the right of that, another perpendicular line with a break in it, which she labeled window. To the right and below that window, she drew 4 gravestones, and next to them, a little mound of earth. A child's new grave without a headstone yet. She didn't label those. Then she put the chalk into the tray beneath the blackboard and turned to him. "Exactly," Frances said, and recited again. He saw her from the bottom of the stairs before she saw him. She was starting down, looking back over her shoulder at some fear. Joanna took a little step away from the front, from all these eyes watching her toward her seat at the side of the room. He put his hand lightly on her elbow. So, Joanna, does the young husband stay at the bottom of the stairs? No, he goes up the stairs to her. To find out what she's looking at? Yes. And does he find out? Yes, the grave where their child is buried in the family graveyard. Their only child, you think? She nodded her head. What made you think so? He asked her. Because it's so sad. All right, he said. Ordinarily, he wouldn't accept this answer. He'd make her go to the text where the facts were. He'd make her find the words baby and first child as evidence that the young couple's loss was complete. But she'd brought her own grief to the poem. So he said, yes, it's very sad. They only have each other now. He hoped she would take some comfort that though she no longer had her brother, she had her parents, and her parents had her. And does she stay at the top of the stairs, he asked. For a while, Joanna answered, that's all. Just for a while, he said, yes. And then what? She ducks beneath his arm and goes downstairs, Joanna answered. Where he was at the beginning? More than that, Joanna said. She goes right out of the house. Hey, Joanna, he said, you're a good reader. He let go of her elbow. Thanks. She smiled shyly and moved back to her seat. She was glad he had given her a second chance to raise her hand. He turned to the class then and asked, what's a husband's reaction when he discovers what his wife's been looking at? Angela Nash had her hand up before he'd finished asking the question. She had black curly hair and pale skin and looked younger than her 14 years. Angela, he said, you're going to tell us? He's kind of amazed, Angela answered. Amazed, yes, you're right. It's in the way he speaks, isn't it? It's in the tone of the words, he said, rewarding her for leaping in, taking a chance with half an answer, the way a boy would. Angela smiled and nodded, proud of her success. Amazed at what? He pursued. What's he amazed at? Surely he knew the graveyard was out back and his child was in it. Angela hesitated. Well, read the words, Frances told her. Angela looked down at her book. She scanned the poem, looking for the passage, didn't find it right away. Now a lot of hands were up. One of them was Sarah Warrior's. He called on her. The wonder is I didn't see it once, Sarah read. Her voice was quiet. I never noticed it from up here before. I must be wanted to it, that's the reason. The little graveyard where my people are, so small the window frames the whole of it. There are 3 stones of slate and 1 of marble, broad-shouldered little slabs there in the sunlight on the side hill. We haven't to mind those, but I understand. It's not the stones, but the child's mound. Sarah stopped reading, looked up from the book. He couldn't read the expression on her face, had no idea what she was thinking. He was tempted to read the passage over aloud because Sarah had read it so quietly, but he wouldn't risk her taking that as a put-down, for she was fragile too, a stranger in a foreign place. Instead, he said, thank you, Sarah, and asked the question again, this time to the whole class. What is it exactly that he is amazed at? Several hands went up. One of them was Amy's, though she only put it up halfway and took it down as soon as she remembered how bored she was. Amy, he said, tell us. Amy sighed. You don't know, he said, laying his little trap. If she didn't answer, she wouldn't appear above this. She'd just look dumb. He's amazed that he had to look out the window to find out that he didn't know all along what his wife keeps looking at, she finally answered. Frances waited for more. He wonders why he didn't look out the window too every time he went by. Your evidence, he asked. The line. I must be wanted to it, Amy quoted, quick as a flash, without even looking at her book. And how does his wife feel? That he shouldn't be amazed. I mean, his kid is dead, Amy said, and almost added, for Christ's sake, to get back to being negative, but she didn't dare. Frances didn't answer, just stood there and waited as if she hadn't answered yet. Now she was thinking hard in spite of herself. He looked away from her to ask someone else. And then, just in time, it came to her, the precision he was demanding. Oh, all right, she said, as if he were just quibbling. Her point's not that he shouldn't be amazed. Her point is he shouldn't get used to his kid being dead. Good catch, Amy, Frances said. Well, it's obvious, she said, and checked out again, returning to her slouch. Frances scanned the room and asked another question. What does the wife do now? The woman named Amy. Sarah answered. His wife, Amy, tells him to stop talking, and then she ducks under his arm and goes down to the bottom of the stairs. Frances nodded and recited aloud to confirm her answer. Don't, she cried. She withdrew, shrinking from beneath his arm that rested on the banister, and slid downstairs and turned on him with such a daunting look he said twice over before he knew himself, "Can't a man speak of his own child he's lost?" As he recited, he moved across the space in the center of the room to where Bridget Younger sat at the right-hand row of tables, blonde head down, taking notes. She'd written pages of notes in the classes they'd had so far, but hardly said a word. He reached across the table and pointed to the lines in Bridget's book in which the husband answers his own question. God, what a woman. And it's come to this. A man can't speak of his own child that's dead? He said the lines out loud while he kept his finger on them. Now Bridget couldn't write in her notebook because his arm was across it. Bridget, he asked, can you read her answer? Bridget looked up at him. He could see how anxious she was, how afraid of failing, and knew she hadn't even begun to know the pain of the young couple in the poem. All she knew was that if she wrote down everything her teacher said, she would be safe. And all he knew was that he wanted to give her poetry, the skill of reading it, that engenders the love of it, that would last the whole of her life. Give it a try, Bridget. You can't because you don't know how to speak, Bridget read. Right, he said, and her face brightened just a little, some of the anxiety melting. So, go on. Bridget read. You could sit there with the stain still on your shoes of the fresh earth from your own baby's grave and talk about your everyday concerns. You had stood the spade against the wall out there in the entry, for I saw it. Frances interrupted here and said the husband's lines. I shall laugh, the worst laugh I ever laughed. I'm cursed. God, if I don't believe I'm cursed. Bridget looked up at Frances, encouraged. She resumed. I can repeat the very words you were saying. 3 foggy mornings and 1 rainy day will rot the best birch fence a man can build. Think of it. Talk like that at such a time. What has how long it takes a birch to rot to do what was in the darkened parlor? You couldn't care. He stopped her there. Good work, Bridget, he said. So what is it exactly that Amy finds indefensible in her husband's behavior, he asked her, throwing her this softball to build her confidence. Lots of hands went up, but not Bridget's. Her hand was holding her pen above her notebook, poised to write down whichever of her classmates' answers Frances would approve. Bridget, he said. Bridget looked up at him, but didn't answer. And now Francesca was waving her hand, dying to answer. Bridget will answer, Frances said. He reached across the table, put his fingers around Bridget's pen, gently removed it from her hand. He held it in his own and waited. He repeated the question. What does she object to, Bridget? That he can think of things like birch rotting when his child's just dead? She was still eyeing her pen in Frances's hand. You tell me, he said. All right, that's what she doesn't like. You're absolutely right, he said, and Bridget smiled. He put the pen down on the table in front of her, but when she reached for it, he put his hand over it until she took her hand away and left the pen alone. Then he turned to the class. Let's see how it comes out, he said. We'll act it out. He wanted them to see how dynamic the poem was. The action, the movement up and down the stairs, the changing of places. Yes, we'll act it out, he said. He was looking straight at Amy. She shook her head. She knew what was coming next. Amy? Amy didn't answer. Well, we need you to play the young mother's part, he said. You've got the same name as she does. Amy put the collar of her jacket up. Not me, she said. He waited. Amy shook her head again, scrunched even further down in her collar. He moved his gaze to Joanna. You want me to be the wife? Joanna asked. She thought he'd given up on Amy. He shook his head. I want you to be the husband. No, you, Joanna answered. You're the only man in the room. That's immaterial, he said. You can take another's part. I'll be the narrator, Francesca said. Her hand was way up, waving again. Good, Francesca. For he wouldn't refuse her again. He was delighted that she understood how different this was from many poems in which the poet does all the talking. He would get them to think about that tomorrow. You can read the narration from your chair, he went on, but I'll not be the husband, he added, hoping that Joanna would relent. To give her time, he told the class how he loved to walk in New England woods, where 100 years ago there was pasture, and find the little graveyards behind the cellar holes. Can we do the poem now? Francesca interrupted. Oh, all right, I'll do it, Amy announced, relenting as if she were doing the class a favor, and stood from her chair, moved around the square of tables to the front of the room. All right, Amy, Frances said. Joanna? But Francesca couldn't wait any longer. She cleared her throat. Home burial, she announced. Wait a minute. We need the husband, Amy said, looking at Joanna. Francesca stopped. Okay, I'll be the husband, Joanna said. Francesca was so eager she started again before Joanna got to the front of the room. He saw her from the bottom of the stairs before she saw him. She was starting down, looking back over her shoulder at some fear. So where's the window I'm looking out of? Amy interrupted. Frances didn't answer. He just raised his eyebrows and then left the front of the room, moved to the seat that Joanna had occupied, and sat down. Behind you, Joanna said, standing next to Amy. She took Amy's hand and turned her so that her back was to the window of the classroom. You're on the landing now, she said, and here's the window you're looking through back over your shoulder to the graveyard. She pointed to the classroom windows. Then she backed away from Amy, facing her toward the other side of the room. Here's the foot of the stairs, she said, and the door is right behind me. Her staging mirrored her drawing on the blackboard. She reached behind herself to touch an imaginary doorknob. Frances allowed himself a smile as Francesca began to read. She took a doubtful step and then undid it to raise herself and look again. He spoke, advancing toward her. Then Joanna read the husband's question. What is it you see from up there always? For I want to know. And Joanna, the young husband now, took her hand off the latch of the door behind her, tilting her head up toward Amy on the stairs, and everyone saw the young husband moving up the stairs to his wife, then climb past her to the window and discover the grave she'd been staring at. The three students rode the poem until near the end, Amy's hand was on the latch. She read the wife's concluding lines. Friends make pretense of following to the grave, but before one's in it, their minds are turned and making the best of their way back to life and living people and things they understand. But the world's evil. I won't have grief, so if I can change it, oh, I won't. Then Amy minded pushing the door wider open, stepping backward away from her husband and out of the house, and Joanna read the last line. I'll follow you and bring you back by force, I will. And then it was over. The stairs melted away. The front door disappeared. The two stood looking at each other, surprised to be who they used to be again, and sensing they were not. After a while, someone asked, do you think she ever comes back? The students looked at Frances, waiting for him to answer, but of course he didn't. He was still in Joanna's seat as if he were one of the students. Joanna and Amy still stood up front. It was their class now more than his. Naturally, she comes back, Joanna said. You think he's going to just let her walk away? She was very sure. After all, she ought to know. She had just played the part. It says right here he's making the best of his way back to life and living people and things they understand. And that's good, you think? Frances asked. That's what he should do? Oh, yes, Joanna said. I do too, he said. Nevertheless, an argument ensued about whether Amy comes back. Some of the girls insisted the poem was too sad for a happy ending. Finally, one of them asked Amy, how'd you feel just now when you played Amy in the poem? I don't know, Amy said, shrugging to show she didn't give a damn, wanted to get back to her disengagement. None of her classmates believed her. They stared and waited. Answer the question, Amy, Frances said from Joanna's seat. Amy turned to Frances, keeping her mouth shut. She wasn't used to being ordered around. Your opinion, Amy? Frances demanded again. He'd keep her there forever if he had to make her answer. She comes home, Amy said, giving in. Why? Because she has no other place to go, Amy said, thinking quickly. For she was damned if she was going to admit she thought the bereaved young mother comes back to her husband out of love. The woman needs a house like everybody else, she said. She has to eat. Amy knew damn well marriage as an economic contract and a trap wasn't what Frost was getting at, but it was a smart answer. She could tell by the look on her classmates' faces she was the only one who had thought of it. Now she had her persona back to go with her black clothes and spiked hair. Francis had to admit he liked her answer. It showed how smart she was. Nevertheless, he wouldn't let her get away with this. I don't think that's what you think at all, he said. How do you know? It's not in the poem, he told her. There's not one word to suggest it is. You're too smart to think there is. She didn't answer. And besides, it's not how you read the part, he said. That stopped her. She had no answer now. Everyone in the room had seen how much of herself she had put into the other Amy. She looked out the window, and he let her go. They'd made enough inroads for one day. A few minutes later, in the middle of a discussion in which he hardly said a word, of all the meanings of home that shimmer in the poem, the time ran out. When the bell rang to end the period, the conversation went on. He had to order the students to leave. There are bad days when no matter what you try, nothing works. And there are good days when everything you try is magic. This had been one of the good days. No one in this class would ever be the same again. Well, that's it. Thank you for listening. And once again, I'm really grateful to Orinda Books for letting me read here in a real bookstore, surrounded by books which we all love. And I'm very grateful to all independent bookstores for serving their communities, because the best place to buy a book is in a bookstore where you can actually pick up the books and feel them in your hands and read them and browse them. So once again, thank you. Goodbye.